In this video, we're talking about subtracting decimals. Now, if you remember how to add decimals, subtracting decimals isn't really all that different. Or if you already watched the adding decimals video, a lot of this will be familiar because it's pretty much the same steps as far as what you do with your numbers before you start subtracting. So, first step, you need to line the number up by the decimal. So you've got your decimals all lined up in a row. Once you have your decimals lined up in a row, you fill in any gaps with 0. Then you bring your decimal down into your answer and then subtract. So let's just try one. Let's look at a problem. Let's say I wanted to do 17 and 2/10 subtract 6 and 1/10. So my first step, line those numbers up by the decimal. So I'm going to write the first number, 17 and 2/10. Well, okay, I did this in the last video, but I always forget. Let's back up and talk about why we need to line it up by the decimal. If I was subtracting this, 36 subtract 2, you guys know that when I stack it to subtract it, I go 36 subtract, and then I put the 2 here. You guys know that. If I put the 2 over here, it throws off your entire answer, and it makes it wrong. And that's because the 2 is in the ones place. So is the 6. The 6 is in the ones place. The 3 is in the tens place. Now if you have tens, like if you have had like those long bars, the tens, and we were subtracting 2 ones, we'd be just taking away 2. But we wouldn't take away 2 of these big bars. That doesn't make sense. We're just taking away 2 ones. So we can't take the 2 away from the 3. We have to take it away from the 6. We have to line it up by place value. The ones place with the ones place. And then we can subtract. 6 minus 4 is 2. 3 minus nothing is 3. Same idea with decimals. We have to line it up by the place value. And the decimal helps us with that. So we write the first number, 17 and 2/10. Line it up by the decimal. If you watch the other video, you'll know that I do this. I draw a line to keep it all lined up. So I'm just going to draw the decimal for that number and then write everything normally around it. The 6 is to the left in the ones place. The 1 is to the right in the tenths place. And then let's just stop and look. This is the tenths place. And this is the tenths place. And the 2 and the 1 are lined up together. This is the ones place. This is the tens. And this is the ones. So ones place, and they're lined up. Tens place, there's nothing in the tens place here, and so it doesn't need to be lined up. So we've lined them up by the decimal and by their place value. Now we're going to fill in any gaps with a 0. I'm going to bring my decimal down into my answer, that way I don't forget it or lose it. And now I'm going to subtract. 2 subtract 1 is 1. 7 subtract 6 is 1. Oh, I forgot the subtraction sign. 1 subtract 0 is 1. So my answer is 11 and 1/10. Let's do another problem. 37 and 8/10 subtract 24. No, let's go 2 and 4/10. So write the first number, 37 and 8/10. We're going to line them up by the decimal, 2 and 4/10. Fill in any gaps with zeros. Bring your decimal down into your answer and subtract. 8 subtract 4 is 4. 7 subtract 2 is 5. 3 subtract 0 is 3. Now these problems have been fine because we haven't had to borrow yet, but what if we had to borrow? Well, we can still borrow even if we're dealing with a decimal. So let's look at one. 73 and 1/10 subtract 9 and 45 hundredths. All right, follow the same rules. Write the first number, line it up by the decimal. So 9/4500ths. Fill in any gaps with zeros. Here's a gap in the tenths place, fill it in. Here's a gap in the tens place, fill it in. Bring the decimal down into the answer and subtract. Now, if you've already watched the subtraction video, or if you know how to subtract and borrow, no problem. 0 minus 5. Well, if I have 0 cookies, can I give anyone 5 of them? No, that doesn't work. So that means I have to borrow. I'm going to borrow from the closest neighbor, which is the 1. So I'm going to take 1 from the 1, and the 1 becomes a 0. And that 1 that I borrowed gets put on the 0, and it becomes 10. Now this is 10, and I know that if I have 10, I can take 5 away, and 10 minus 5 is 5. Now I'm doing this. I'm not doing 1 minus 4 anymore, now I'm doing 0 minus 4. But if I have 0, can I take 4 away? Nope. So I borrow from the closest neighbor. I'm going to borrow 1 from the 3, so that makes the 3 a 2, and that 1 that I just took is going to make this a 10. It was a 0, now it's a 10. Now can I do 10 minus 4? Yep, it is 6. Now I need to do 2, subtract 9. If I have 2 cookies, can I give you 9? No. So I have to borrow from the closest neighbor. That 7 becomes a 6. And that 1 that I just borrowed from the 7 makes this a 12. Now 12 minus 9, count it back, and I will get 3. And I have my last step, 6 minus 0, which is 6. So my answer is 63 and 65/100ths. Let's do another one with borrowing. Let's do 3 and 2/10ths, subtract 2 and 874,000ths. I mean, that's a lot into the decimal. Now I know sometimes you guys just pick the bigger number and put it on top. That's not how it works in subtraction. Order matters. You have to put the first number on top. So we have to write 3 and 2/10ths first. I'm going to line it up by the decimal. And this is 2 and 874,000ths. So I'm going to go 2 and 874,000ths. Just going to erase this line. Now, any gaps I'm going to fill in with a 0. There's nothing in the tenths place, in the hundredths place, so I'm going to fill it with a 0. Nothing in the thousandths place, fill it with a 0. Now bring the decimal down into the answer, and then subtract. 0 minus 4, I can't do it. So I have to borrow from the closest neighbor. But there's nothing here in the hundredths place. It's a 0 as well. So that means I have to borrow all the way from the 2. I'm going to take 1 from the 2, and the 2 becomes a 1. Now that 1 that I just borrowed from it makes this a 10. But I still can't do 0 minus 4. So I've got to borrow from the 10, it becomes a 9, and that 1 that I just borrowed makes this a 10. Now can I do 10 minus 4? Yep, it is 6. 9 minus 7 is 2. 1 minus 8, I can't do that, so I have to borrow from the closest neighbor, which is the 3, and the 3 becomes a 2, and that 1 that I just borrowed makes this an 11, and 11 minus 8 is 3. 2 minus 2, 0. So my answer is 0 and 326,000ths. Okay, now let's talk about what to do if I have a whole number with a decimal. So let's say I was doing 75 and 3/10ths, subtract 4. Well, my first step is always to line it up by the decimal, 75 and 3/10ths. But on 4, there's no decimal. But we know that the 4 is in the ones place and the 5 is in the ones place, and the decimal is always just to the right of the ones place. if you see a whole number and there's no decimal, the decimal's at the end. So on 17, decimal's at the end. 53, decimal's at the end. 1,465, decimal is at the end. Always on a whole number. All right, so we know that the decimal is at the end, so we can line it up by the decimal, and we're going to put the 4 here. So we lined it up by the decimal, fill in any gaps with zeros, 0 here, 0 here, bring the decimal down into our answer, and subtract. 3 minus 0, 3. 5 minus 4, 1. 7 minus 0, 7. And I forgot the subtraction sign again. So our answer is 71 and 3/10. Now let's do a problem where the decimal, or the whole number, is the first number. So how about 63 subtract 8 and 2/10? Well, I know my first step is to line it up by the decimal. And I know that the first number always goes on top. But where's the decimal in 63? Well, remember, if it's a whole number, the decimal is always at the end. So now I need to line it up by the decimal. Here's the decimal on 8 and 2/10. So I'm just going to write 8 and 2/10 like normal. Fill in any gaps with zeros. Bring the decimal down and into the answer. And subtract. 0 minus 2, can't do it. I'm going to erase this line so it doesn't confuse us. I can't do 0 minus 2. I can't take 2 cookies away from 0 cookies. So I have to borrow from the closest neighbor. This becomes a 2, and this becomes 10. 10 minus 2 I can do, and that is 8. So now I go to the next step, 2, and I need to take away 8 from 2. Well, if I only have 2 cookies, I can't take 8 away, so I have to borrow from the 6, and it becomes a 5. The 2 becomes a 12. Now I can take 8 away from 12. If I count it back, I get to 4, and then I do 5 minus 0, which is 5. So my answer is 54 and 8/10. All right, I'm going to give you a few problems, and what I want you to do is when I give you the problem, I want you to pause the video, solve it, and then press play and see if you got the same answer that I did. So let's do this. 37 and 4/10, subtract 8 and 32/100. So go ahead and pause, follow these steps, solve the problem, and then click play when you're ready to see. Okay, let's see how you did. 37 and 4/10. Line it up by the decimal. 8 and 32/100. Fill in any gaps with 0. Drop the decimal down into the answer. And subtract. 0 minus 2, can't do it. Borrow from the neighbor. It becomes a 3, and this becomes a 10. 10 minus 2 is 8. 3 minus 3 is 0. 7 minus 8, can't do it, so I have to borrow from the 3. It becomes a 2. The 7 becomes 17. 17 minus 8 is 9. And 2 minus 0 is 2. Let's do one more. No, I didn't ever tell you. So the answer is 29 and 8/100. I forgot. Sorry about that. All right, here you go. 45 subtract 9 and 67/100. This one's going to have a lot of borrowing, but that's really good practice. So go ahead, pause the video, solve it, and then let's see how you did. All right, first step, line it up by the decimal. And we know on a whole number, the decimal is always at the end. Now, here's our other number, 9 and 67/100. So put the decimal in, 9, 67/100. Fill in the gaps with zeros. Bring the decimal down into the answer and subtract. 0 minus 7, I can't do it, so I have to borrow, but there's nothing to borrow from the 0, so I have to go all the way to the 5, borrow 1 from that, and it becomes a 4. Now the 1 I borrowed from the 5 makes this a 10. but I still can't do 0 minus 7. So I need to borrow from the 10, it becomes a 9, and this 0 becomes a 10. Now I can do 10 minus 7, which is 3. 9 minus 6, I can do that. It's 3. 4 minus 9, I can't do that. So I have to borrow from the 4 over here, and it becomes 3. And the one that I borrowed from that 4 makes this one 14. Now I can do 14 minus 9, which is 5. And then 3 minus 0 is 3. So your answer is 35 and 33 hundredths. Good luck with your subtracting your decimals.